National Heritage Area and by First Tennessee Foundation.
Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay.
One month before General Lee's surrender at Appomattox and the end of the Civil War, a crowd gathered in front of our nation's capital for the second inauguration of President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, a Republican, had chosen Southern Democrat Andrew Johnson as his vice president, symbolizing the approaching restoration of the Union. Johnson, a former senator and slave owner from Tennessee, had spent the last 3 years as the state's military governor. In attendance that day was abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass, whose first glimpse of Johnson would tell him everything he needed to know about the East Tennessean.
There are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and unconsciously to themselves, their true characters may be read by the observant eye. It was at such an instant when I caught a glimpse of the real nature of this man, which all subsequent developments proved true. I was standing in the crowd when Mr. Lincoln pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I had observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he is no friend of our race.
In his address, President Lincoln promised to bind the wounds of the divided country with malice toward none and charity for all. Powerful words which failed to move one audience member. Just a few weeks later, well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth would murder Lincoln, placing Johnson in the White House and in charge of Southern Reconstruction.
I will be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace. I speak now as one who feels all who love equal rights, his friends.
He was so adamant against African Americans getting any equal rights at all that Lincoln became annoyed with Johnson. Johnson is, in my book, outright anti-Black. He's pro-slavery all the way. So when he made that speech, I'll be your Moses to the Blacks in Nashville, remember, he's speaking politically. He can't say, I'm against slaves being freed. But we must remember that Andrew Johnson's attitude was the attitude of many people across the United States. As one writer said, you could legislate laws, but you can't legislate people's hearts.
Privately harboring contempt for freedmen, Andrew Johnson had for years publicly declared his hatred for the wealthy plantation owners who had chosen secession rather than risk losing their slaves.
Robbery is a crime. Rape is a crime. Treason is a crime, and crime must be punished.
When Johnson becomes the president of the United States, The radical Republicans believe they have someone we can work with in Johnson. They've had issues with President Lincoln. Lincoln has been a roadblock in the path of radical Reconstruction in the South. Johnson's on record. I am your Moses to the Tennessee freed people. His statements of punishing traitors in the South. Little did they know that Johnson would be much worse than Abraham Lincoln.
Andrew Johnson was part of the slaveocracy. He wasn't a major plantation owner, but he owned slaves. Their world was based on that premise. So much of it, not just political power, but their culture, their own identity. So that's hard to move away from.
When he gets to the presidency, blacks go to see him. Frederick Douglass, 6 or 7 are black delegation, and they visit Johnson, and Johnson is sitting there looking all mean and mad because these Negroes would dare, come and question him about, what are you going to do about black Reconstruction? We think blacks ought to have equal rights, and they also ought to have the suffrage, that is, the right to vote. And Johnson looks at them and says, well, we're not going to uplift the black man before we uplift poor whites in this country. And he's particularly angry when the issue comes about giving blacks equal citizenship, because he's arguing, well, we've got all these whites coming in as immigrants, and they were pouring in, who've got to wait, 7 years before they can become a citizen. And you're asking the country just to grandfather in 4.5 million slaves and free Negroes, and they don't have to do anything. They just automatically become citizens. So he was totally against that, and Johnson would try all he could to impede that. Douglass interrupts him. Johnson is angry. He said, well, we see where the president stands, so we'll go to the people. And Johnson says, well, you go to the people. I understand the people too, he's very angry. And so after that, black Reconstruction is going to be different, because blacks are going to have to go around Johnson, and they're going to go directly to Congress. After Douglass and the black delegation left, Johnson says to one of his colleagues, that so-and-so Frederick Douglass, he would as well cut a white man's throat as anything. So Johnson was determined that they were not going to rise faster than the poor white man rose.
Tennessee, like much of the South, had been devastated by the war. Farms and homes had been pillaged by foraging armies. Infrastructure had been destroyed. Thousands of fathers and sons would not be returning home, while thousands more would never be the same. Shaken to its very foundation, the Southern economy, based primarily on the enslavement of millions of African Americans, had been crushed, and difficult questions arose from the ruins.
How do you deal with this huge population of people who are saying to the nation, we're not going to be slaves? Economically, how do you reconstruct the South? And you can't do that unless you have a stable labor system, unless you have some way of getting the crops in and getting the production restarted. You have this agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, that's created, the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, and that describes everything that they're responsible for. It's created to try to figure out, what do you do with the freedmen? How do you introduce this free labor system into the South, and how's it going to work? And again, nobody really knows.
The plan was just for 1 year to provide the kinds of immediate things that they needed: food, shelter, medical assistance, legal assistance. The Freedmen's Bureau kind of evolves and takes on different roles over time as it becomes necessary to negotiate land deals, work contracts.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the people who are involved in this process are people who are thinking in terms of what is in the best interest of the freed people. And what that eventually results in is the exploitation of Black labor.
The Civil War left so many Blacks without mothers and fathers before the age of 18. Remember, many of these people are split up on farms and plantations. Their mother and father's gone somewhere else. And so they had an apprenticeship program, and that apprenticeship program allowed farmers to gain an apprenticeship certificate for homeless or orphan Black children. And they could keep them until they were 18 years of age. And so they were practically slaves.
If you look at the Freedmen's Bureau records, if you look at court papers, you see cases where children who had once been slaves on a plantation, they turn up in court records as now being indentured to the owner of that plantation, and the owner of the plantation saying the parents abandoned the child. That could mean a lot of things. You see some cases in Memphis, again, where fathers return from the military to discover that their children have been indentured to their former owners. You see women who have no other way of supporting themselves other than remaining in the countryside. And even if they come to the city, that's no guarantee that they'll be able to remain in the city. Many of them were forced back to the rural countryside. So here's a woman who is poor, who has to work on a plantation, who is forced to sign a labor contract, sometimes by the Freedmen's Bureau.
Far from perfect, the Freedmen's Bureau was understaffed and underfunded, but managed to ease the transition to freedom in a number of ways.
Perhaps its most enduring gift to Black America was the establishment of schools. The newly freedmen really wanted education. They had a thirst and a desire that was unparalleled up until that time.
Some of the first institutions that developed are the schools and the churches within these communities. People valued education as a way of getting ahead, as a way of preparing them for the future, as a way of maybe making sure that the life that you're going to live in the future is not the life that you've lived for so long.
We shall be heard before Congress and before the legislature. We want the rights guaranteed by the infinite architect. For these rights we labor. For them we will die. We have gained one, the uniform. We want two more boxes besides the cartridge box, the ballot and the jury box. We shall gain them.
One thing that really propelled the quick formation of political organizations among African Americans, people forget that there were free Blacks in numbers in Tennessee before the Civil War. Now, they weren't in huge numbers, just in the hundreds, but that gave you some basis to start thinking politically. These people had been thinking politically. They had been their own independent actors. These weren't guys being led by someone. They knew what they wanted to accomplish as new citizens of the United States.
As freedmen demanded new rights, former masters lamented the loss of theirs. Ex-Confederates, the overwhelming majority of Tennessee voters, had been disfranchised, effectively banning rebel soldiers and sympathizers from the electoral process. During the war, Confederates had made the lives of anti-secessionists a living hell. Now the Unionists, hungry for revenge, were in control of state government. No one was surprised when they chose a sharp-tongued East Tennessee preacher turned newspaper owner to become governor. William Ganaway Brownlow earned his nickname, the Fighting Parson, through years of scathing editorials aimed at secessionists, his old political foe, Andrew Johnson, and anyone else who disagreed with him. Imprisoned and later forced to leave the state by Confederate authorities, Brownlow was widely considered the most hated man in Tennessee.
The best way to characterize William Brownlow's governing style in Tennessee is to look at his newspaper. When Brownlow returned to Knoxville with the Union Army in August 1863, he quickly reset up his newspaper. And when his first paper rode off the press in November of 63, it was now titled Brownlow's Knoxville Whig and Rebel Ventilator, which reflected his editorial strategy.
Let them be punished. Let them be impoverished. Let them be slain. After slain, let them be damned.
The Civil War and Reconstruction in Tennessee is a story that's rich in irony. Tennessee was exempted from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation out of fear that it would collapse the Unionist coalition because of the abolishment of slavery, which was very unpopular among many Unionists. And yet, Tennessee was the first among the Confederate states to abolish the institution of slavery, nearly 7 weeks before the collapse of the Confederacy.
There was no controversy in Tennessee about going ahead and freeing the slaves in early 1865. The problem became for Tennessee, now that the war is over, how do we come back together? The ex-Confederates cannot vote, but in the State House, you have two different groups of Unionists. You have the radicals who want to punish the ex-Confederates for all of the damage of the war and make sure that they are never allowed to return to power. And then you have these conservative Unionists who are determined to put the war behind them and bring the state back together as peacefully as possible. The conservative Unionists felt like these people were our neighbors. The war is over and done with. We freed the slaves. Let us bring our state back together. So you began seeing a tremendous tension between Governor Brownlow and some of the more conservative members of the Tennessee General Assembly.
Tensions stretched far beyond the confines of the capital. Former rebels, furious about the rising power of radical Unionists and former slaves, resorted to the same type of guerrilla vigilantism common during the war. Several terrorist bands formed across the South. However, none would achieve the size or infamy of the Ku Klux Klan. Formed in Pulaski, Tennessee by 6 former Confederate officers, the Klan would grow in numbers and ferocity as freedmen attained more rights.
They were hell-bent on targeting radicals, whether they were white or black. They're usually seen as targeting blacks. But they also targeted white radicals, assassinated a Tennessee senator, Senator Case.
But night riders weren't the only source of violence. Racial tension increased across the state as freedmen crowded into urban areas. In May 1866, the simmer came to a boil in Memphis.
You've got unreconstructed Confederates and black soldiers who are being mustered out of the Union Army through Fort Pickering, which was the Union fort here. So you've got a growing number of black soldiers who are in the fort, but also in the community as a whole. And you've got this conflict that's developing. And then there's a confrontation on the street, and it kind of bubbles up into a major, major riot, a massacre, really. The overwhelming number of victims of robbery, murder, rape, everything in the city during that 3-day period is African American. In the course of the riot, of course, every black church building or school that had been built is burned. Many, many black businesses that are beginning to start, they are destroyed. So it's very clear that this is not just a fight between two groups. There's a political thing that's going on here. There's this feeling that this Black community is emerging. Now we have to suppress it.
Leaving 48 dead, 46 of whom were Black, and more than 100 injured. The Memphis riot was a wake-up call to radical Republicans in Washington. Fed up with Andrew Johnson's lenient restoration policy, Republicans had begun exercising their power to override presidential vetoes of civil rights legislation. Presidential Reconstruction was giving way to congressional or radical Reconstruction.
Congress proposed another amendment, the 14th Amendment, which said that all people are protected by the due process of law. And this 14th Amendment essentially guaranteed African Americans their rights as citizens, and Congress took over Reconstruction. They weren't willing to just restore the Union. Congress wanted to rebuild their whole political structure. That was totally contrary to Andrew Johnson's views of how the South should be brought back into the Union.
Back in Tennessee, the Fighting Parsons saw things differently. Willing to do whatever it took to return his state to the Union, he made passing the new amendment a priority. This would pit him against his fellow East Tennessean and now president for the first time since the rebellion began. For nearly 30 years, Brownlow and Andrew Johnson were political rivals, but their loyalty to the Union trumped any other disagreement. During the war, they joined forces against secession. With Tennessee's restoration within reach, however, Brownlow had no qualm about angering the man he used to refer to as Toady Johnson.
It's a showdown between Governor Brownlow and President Johnson. When the amendment came to the floor in the General Assembly for ratification, for a vote, Tennessee's conservative legislators skipped town. All that was left were the radical Republicans, and thus we have a problem: no quorum in order to take a vote on the 14th Amendment. Governor Brownlow had the sheriff of Davidson County arrest the conservative legislators. The sheriff was able to locate 2 conservative legislators and brought them back to the General Assembly, where they were kept under lock and key. A quorum was now established, although they were not allowed to vote. After the 14th Amendment was ratified by the General Assembly, Governor Brownlow wired the clerk of the United States Senate to declare, "We have fought the battle and won it. 2 of Andrew Johnson's tools not voting. Please give my regards to the dead dog of the White House."
Tennessee was welcomed back into the Union, but the Fighting Parsons' heavy-handed tactics were taking a toll on radical rule. Many of his supporters were beginning to align themselves with the conservatives. With elections approaching and radical support dwindling, Brownlow was convinced by his colleagues to extend voting rights to the freedmen.
Now is the time for Tennessee to show to the world that she belongs to the advance guard on the great question of equal suffrage. Without their votes, the state will pass into disloyal hands, and a reign of terror will be the result.
Brownlow did not believe that blacks and whites should be equal. But Brownlow is an opportunist, and Brownlow is a practical politician as much as Lincoln is. And Brownlow knows his political success is based upon whether he can keep control of Tennessee. And the one way to do that is to enfranchise Negroes.
In February 1867, Tennessee became the first rebel state to allow black men to vote. This further infuriated most Tennesseans, including many radicals, but the ballots of 40,000 pro-Union freedmen would ensure Brownlow's re-election, continued radical rule, and bloodshed.
That really was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Once black suffrage is a reality in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan's numbers multiplied. Lawlessness pervaded large portions of middle and western Tennessee.
3 months after black enfranchisement, former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Wizard of the Saddle, became Grand Wizard of the KKK. Famous for his success as a cavalry commander and infamous for the massacres of black Union soldiers at Fort Pillow, Forrest publicly denied his involvement with the Klan while defending its purpose.
There was a great deal of insecurity felt by the Southern people. There were a great many Northern men coming down there, forming leagues all over the country. The Negroes were holding night meetings and were going about and becoming insolent. And the Southern people all over the state were very much alarmed. I think this organization was got up to protect the weak, with no political intention at all.
Contrary to Forrest's claim, returning Democrats to power was its primary goal, and efforts to reach that goal, using intimidation, terrorism, and cold-blooded murder, intensified with black suffrage.
They took me from the house and stripped me and whipped me with a strap of leather with a buckle on the end, striking me 175 licks. This Klan asked me if I was a radical. They told me that no colored man should vote in the presidential election, that they should be killed first. I do not believe that any colored or white Union man is safe. The Klan which whipped me told me to take my bloody shirt and carry it to Brownlow.
Tennessee's readmission to the Union in 1866 exempted it from further federal reconstruction, which also meant the loss of federal troops. The Fighting Parson was in desperate need of someone to fight the Klan.
Brownlow's answer to the Ku Klux Klan was his own Radical State Guard, which he put together in 1867. Their mission was simple: go out and find the Ku Klux Klan, arrest them. The problem is that once the State Guard was assembled, the Ku Klux Klan wisely went into hiding.
While effective, keeping the State Guard in the field was expensive, a problem compounded by the enormous debt Tennessee accumulated as a result of the war. In a lethal game of cat and mouse, as soon as the troops were withdrawn, night riders returned with a vengeance.
Things were so bad in Tennessee that we were very near having a little internal war within our own state. The situation here was so bad with the Klan's harassment of freedmen and indirect harassment of Governor Brownlow that John McCormick Lee, a very conservative unionist, went to Washington and met with President Johnson, saying the fact that Brownlow refuses to let any of the ex-Confederates vote is creating a very volatile situation. President Johnson was unable to step in by that point. He had his own personal problems to contend with in Washington.
This is one of the last great battles with slavery. Driven from the legislative chambers, driven from the field of war, this monstrous power has found a refuge in the executive mansion. Nobody can question it. Andrew Johnson is the impersonation of the tyrannical slave power. In him, it lives again.
The conflict between President Andrew Johnson and Congress was inevitable. Congress felt that he was far too lenient on his fellow Southerners, and he felt that Congress was too hard. So the showdown really began when Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, saying that the President of the United States could not fire anyone from his cabinet without the expressed approval by the United States Congress. And Johnson had been at odds throughout his presidency with his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and Johnson fired him. So the House of Representatives promptly drew up impeachment charges against President Johnson for violation of the Tenure of Office Act.
The act to remove Secretary Stanton was designed to lead to impeachment, because what president could not fight against such a law that he could not remove his own cabinet officers without congressional approval? It was a step across the line of separation of powers. So this is where constitutional scholars look at Johnson and say, well, maybe he wasn't a great president, but he was right to stand up for the presidency in that whole dispute because the radical Republicans had gone too far.
Johnson's impeachment proceedings, the first in U.S. history, dragged on for most of the spring in 1868. The final vote could not have been much closer.
He missed being impeached by just one vote. The two congressmen from Tennessee voted for acquittal. One of those congressmen was Johnson's son-in-law.
Johnson's battle to remain in Washington was over, but back in Tennessee, the battle with the Klan was raging. Reports of violent raids across the state led Governor Brownlow to reassemble his militia. The Fighting Parsons' orders to exterminate the KKK were met with threats of all-out war from the wizard himself.
If they go hunting down and shooting these men, there will be war, and a bloodier one than we've ever witnessed. I have told these radicals what they might expect in such an event. I have no powder to burn killing Negroes. I intend to kill the radicals. And if trouble should break out, not one of them would be left alive.
In spite of death threats, Brownlow redeployed the militia, sending the Night Riders temporarily back into the shadows. Midway through his second term as governor, the Fighting Parsons set his sights on a new goal: transitioning to the national political arena as a U.S. senator.
Brownlow's shift to the Senate shocked a lot of people because, well, he had fought so hard as governor and said he was willing to give his life for the cause and taken such radical steps himself. But I think he could see the handwriting on the wall. His own support within the Republican Party in Tennessee had faded because of some of his extra-constitutional actions. Also, I think he understood that maybe the federal government was not worried about Tennessee. They had southern states with bigger issues than Tennessee at that time.
So the General Assembly was quite happy to elect him to that position, and our Speaker of the Senate, DeWitt Center, became governor of Tennessee.
The new Republican governor took the reins of a party that was tearing itself apart. Governor Center, a moderate, watched helplessly as radical Unionists, which included the Freedmen, and conservative factions, who were rebel sympathizers, became further polarized. As Center's campaign for re-election geared up, the infighting erupted in May of 1869 at the Republican Convention in Nashville.
Tennessee's radical Republicans became the laughingstock as these reports of delegates throwing punches, pistols being drawn.
News of the mayhem would pale in comparison to reaction of Governor Center's address to the convention.
After discussing his vision for a post-Civil War Tennessee, Center then turned to the issue of the day and dropped a political bomb as he announced that he was now in favor of universal suffrage, extending the right to vote to the former Confederates. He needs the conservatives in order to beat the radicals. That's the key to winning the governorship in Tennessee. And here we get the process of Center ensuring his election. He begins removing Brownlow-appointed commissioners of registration. One of Center's appointees is John P. Bogner, who has a checkered past. He is acknowledged as a Unionist during the Civil War, but he's also known for having Confederate sympathies as well. You start getting letters from people in Shelby County to Governor Center saying this guy is a Confederate. And what's he doing? He's giving the right to vote not only to conservatives, but he's also giving the right to vote to former Confederates. And that's what started happening with these conservative commissioners. They started extending the right to vote to the former Confederates. And we get William versus Bogner. And in the Supreme Court, a court of Brownlow appointed justices, they find in favor of Governor Center. Center, as governor, has a right to appoint his own officials. This was a power that Brownlow and Brownlow's legislature had given Brownlow. So not only is Center using the election machinery that radical Republicans created for Brownlow, he's also using powers that Brownlow's legislators gave him. Once Williams versus Bogner comes down in favor of Center, we begin to see a wholesale removal of any remaining Brownlow-appointed commissioners of registration. And so now we see Tennessee Confederates flocking to the Commissioner of Registration's office for a certificate. And there are reports coming into Center that there are as many as 1,000 to 2,000 rebels getting certificates a day.
Governor Center had opened a political Pandora's box, and former rebels swarmed the polls on Election Day.
The rebels are jubilant, insolent, and overbearing. The elections in this end of the state will all be carried by force and fraud for Center. What is to become of us?
Even after the August 1869 election, when Governor Center is reelected and Reconstruction is collapsing in Tennessee, Tennessee radicals don't give up hope. They still believe that the Republicans in Congress in Washington will overturn this election. They believe President Grant will invalidate the election returns. And so we have a race to Washington right after the election. But President Grant can't be found in Washington. He's in New York City. And so when the Tennessee radicals leave Washington to go up to New York City to have a conversation with President Grant to see what the president can do, will he intervene in Tennessee? Who do they find there? Governor Center has already arrived in New York City, and he's having a conversation with the President Grant. In this private closed-door meeting with the president, Center reassures Grant that Tennessee has been thoroughly reconstructed, that there was no election fraud in Tennessee. There are no more rebels in Tennessee.
Pleas from Tennessee radicals for federal intervention received little support from President Grant or Congress. There would be no rescue for Reconstruction. Back in the state capitol, redeemed Confederates wasted little time erasing Parson Brownlow's legislation.
So with the ex-Confederates now voting and coming back to Nashville to the General Assembly, one of the very first things that took place was a rewriting of the state constitution. A constitutional convention was held. The Constitution was written to be heavily in favor of the ex-Confederates. And at that point, James C. Napier, a Nashvilleian who was an African-American lawyer and businessman, went to Washington with a delegation of other African-Americans from Nashville to plead with President Ulysses S. Grant to send troops to Nashville to protect the African-Americans. Mr. Napier saw that the voting rights were soon going to dissipate and be taken away. And he wanted Tennessee to be put under military reconstruction as the other 10 states of the Confederacy had been.
Why did Congress intervene in other southern states but never in Tennessee? And that's because Tennessee had been readmitted to the Union. No one in Congress believed they had the authority to do so now that there was a loyal, functioning civil government in Tennessee. Tennessee's Reconstruction experience should have served as a warning to the radical Republicans in Washington, D.C. If radical Reconstruction wasn't going to work in Tennessee, in a state that had a sizable unionist coalition, radical Reconstruction wasn't going to work anywhere in the South.
The war-weary nation was eager to close what had been the most painful chapter in its young history. Turning its gaze westward, America turned its back on its most vulnerable citizens. Promises of new rights, new freedoms, would have to wait for nearly 100 years. The freedmen's brief moment in the sun was fading and would soon set across the South.
In revising the Constitution, they put in a lot of racial things in there. Poll tax, anti-miscegenation, Jim Crow stuff went into the 1870 Tennessee Constitution that was allowed by the federal government. The failure of Reconstruction made the federal government a co-conspirator in the establishment of Jim Crow in the United States.
Insult was added to injury in 1871 when Governor Center was succeeded by John Calvin Brown, a former Confederate general and leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
The Klan dispersed to some degree after ex-Confederates came back to power, but just because the Klan disintegrated did not mean this pervasive racism and resentment towards the former slaves was ended. Indeed, that racism and tremendous resistance to equality continued to live on. Throughout the 1870s and 80s, across the South, African Americans continued to lose more and more ground economically, politically, in every way. The ex-Confederates, before the Civil War, had wealth because of land and slaves. Now they've lost their slaves, but they haven't lost their land. The wealthiest, most elite landowners were able to come back to their former position and status in the state. The way that they were able to do this was by instituting, as a substitute for slave labor, sharecropping labor.
The whole labor process after the Civil War for free people goes through stages. You know, at first it's that contract that the Freedmen's Bureau is helping to negotiate. Then you start to see in some of the labor contracts something that approaches what we'll eventually call sharecropping.
Because I was a slave, I don't own any land. I don't own a home. I don't own much of anything. For 20 years, I had been a slave. I'd been involved in agricultural labor, but you can't farm without land. And because one of the failures of the Freedmen's Bureau was its efforts to redistribute abandoned and confiscated lands because they were reclaimed by their Confederate owners, you find that freed Blacks' only recourse is to become a part of the system where I get to farm your land, and in exchange, you are promised a portion of my harvest, which sounds really good. But I don't have any power in that. One, I have to farm your land. Two, I need supplies to farm your land, which means I probably am running up a credit with you. Three, you're the one that's keeping track of the credit. And four, I'm going to probably have to sell my crop to you anyway. And you're going to tell me what it's valued. You're going to take whatever portion of it that you want, and I might be upside down at the end of every season, which means that instead of you owing me, I now owe you. And attached to that, this horrible cycle of debt is really the perilousness of agriculture and farming, because I can't guarantee a good season. I can't guarantee there's not going to be a drought, there's not going to be a rain, there's not going to be a bug that comes in and swallows up the crop.
Sharecropping was a terribly unfair, cruel institution. The sharecroppers were never able to make enough money to buy pieces of land, and thus they were held to the land in a situation not unlike slavery.
Another thing to include in that is everybody was hurt because in some places in Tennessee, Mississippi, and so on, the majority of sharecroppers were white. Poverty was stalking the South after Reconstruction among whites and blacks, but it was worse among black sharecroppers because now they had no political rights, they had no economic rights whatsoever.
Seeing no future for themselves in an unreconstructed South, thousands of African American Tennesseans left the region as part of the Black Exodus.
Benjamin Pap Singleton, a former slave from Davidson County, really led that exodus. He says to the former slaves, especially in the Nashville, Middle Tennessee area, why should you stay here and be a sharecropper and live on the same plantation where you were a slave? You know, if you live on the same farm and same plantation where you were a slave, nothing is going to change. Singleton goes around to these contraband camps telling people, you know, you need to have your own land where you were black or white. The real commodity in those days and time was a piece of land. And a Homestead Act was passed in 1862. And there's plenty of land out west. And so we estimate maybe 25,000 or more went west on what we call the Black Exodus between 1869 and 1881.
Thousands of colored people, unable to endure the intolerable hardships, injustice, and suffering inflicted upon them by a class of Democrats in the South, had, in utter despair, fled panic-stricken from their homes and sought protection among strangers in a strange land. Thousands more were congregating along the banks of the Mississippi, hailing the passing steamers and imploring them for a passage to the land of freedom, where the rights of citizens are respected and honest toil rewarded by honest compensation. The very air was burdened with the cry of distress from American citizens flying from persecutions which they could no longer endure.
The federal government did a very poor job in supporting the Black Exodus. In fact, they had a congressional hearing, and they were opposed to it. They were finding ways to stop blacks from going into Kansas and into Oklahoma and into Nebraska and Iowa and those places where you could get free land, because whites were objecting. We don't want any competition, and now you're going to send 4 million slaves out here to be homesteaders.
We regard this attempt to transfer a people without means and without intelligence from the homes of their nativity as injurious to the people of the South and injurious to the black people themselves. All the attempts of legislation, inflammatory appeals of politicians and newspapers, the misdirected philanthropy of certain classes of citizens, and all other influences to disturb the equanimity of the colored people of the South and to make them discontented with their position, are doing them an incalculable injury, to say nothing of pecuniary losses inflicted upon Southern communities. Congress, having enacted all the legislation for the benefit of the colored people of the South which it can enact, place these people upon a footing of perfect equality before the law. The sooner they are taught to know that their true interest is promoted by cultivating the friendship of their white neighbors instead of their enmity, the sooner they will gain that friendship. And once fully attained, there is nothing to bar the way to their speedy civilization and advancement in wealth and prosperity.
They should have supported it rather than opposed it. And if more African Americans could have been independent, and that is by being landowners, then the post-Reconstruction history probably would have turned out differently.
Reconstruction in Tennessee is the great missed opportunity. The state had suffered so much during the Civil War period. We all know the major battles. We all know the hundreds of thousands who were affected directly by the war. It just scarred families for generations. They did have a chance to maybe envision a different future and to move forward, but the state wasn't ready for it, just like the nation wasn't ready for it, because that would have called for really thinking about what white supremacy meant in a former slave society, and people were not ready to go that way. They think about it as a failure because integration didn't happen and we still had segregation, and Jim Crow would come, and sharecropping was almost as bad as slavery. Consider that phrase, almost as bad. It's not slavery. It's economic peonage, but it's not slavery. And yes, I think as a state and a nation, we missed a chance to move forward quicker, but it wasn't in the cards. But did African Americans focus just on what they didn't get? No, they focused on what they had. And they did have this sort of new breath of freedom. And they were not slaves anymore. And they could start to build their own institutions. And they did. I mean, certainly there were philanthropic societies and missionary groups helping African Americans start things, but that's all they did to help them start, to sustain them, to grow them, to become neighborhoods, communities.
Black communities began to gather their resources together and to provide services. You have churches, Black congregations that are separating themselves from the white congregations that they had once been a part of and organizing or setting up their own independent Black churches. They want to construct their own building, but they start to worship first in what's called a brush arbor. They hold all kinds of fairs and bake sales and everything to raise money. They even raise money to provide for the services of a doctor for African Americans in this community. And that's pretty much what you saw happening, how communities, the Black community itself in Memphis, and I'm sure Nashville as well, begins to gather together to provide for some of these services.
I always look to the community of Orange Mound, Tennessee. Now, folks who lived there in Orange Mound in 1860s, they weren't even a person. They were 3/5 of a person according to the Constitution. In 1870, well, they were a person now with freedom, maybe not full civil rights at all, but opportunity. And by 1890, they had built there in Memphis the state's first all African American neighborhood, designed by African Americans, lived in by African Americans who were not renters, they were homeowners. They had started down that path. Now, what a transition for those individuals in 1860 who were 3/5 of a person. They were now a property owner.
It's amazing that in spite of every adversity, which seems like every single block being stacked up against you, that there are Blacks who come out of this period who are able to create a world for themselves, to create opportunities for their families.
It was certainly a time of challenge. But let's look at what was created when you consider the primacy of some of these universities, such as Fisk University, Lane College in Jackson, Lemoyne-Owen College in Memphis. These have produced thousands upon thousands of graduates who have affected and changed America. And then you think of the churches, and you think of the schools, and you think of all of these institutions that grew out of this time. Those are still the bedrock of our African American communities and neighborhoods today. That's where they go back to celebrate themselves, their families, their traditions. That's no mean feat being created in these terrible years of Reconstruction.
Tennessee Civil War 150 is made possible in part by Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and by First Tennessee Foundation.
I feel like Pima gives students great support.
The people here work hard to make sure that our goals and dreams are realized.
We get to do injections on each other.
Anatomy and physiology is hands-on experience at its best.
All right, welcome everybody. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm really happy to be here, and we're going to talk about something more important than the Eastern Theater, and that is, of course, the Western Theater. And we've got a couple of guys with us to really, hit some of this hard. We're going to end up focusing on sort of November in Tennessee, a little 1863, a little 1864, and a whole lot to put that into context. We're joined here, if your screen looks like mine, on the upper left by Dave Powell. Dave Powell's a prolific writer and historian and expert